Hey guys, Argent here. So this will probably ruffle a few feathers. I know I always say that and I never get as much hate as I think I'm going to get, but we'll just dive into this. So this is kind of my thoughts as to the old order and the new order, and kind of the tradition and the transition in right-wing politics that occurred primarily over the 19th century and in the early 20th. Although it's kind of more or less been around since the Enlightenment. So the old order is obviously kind of what existed prior to the Enlightenment, and to some extent persisted into it depending on the country. The old order was more or less a society where you had the nobility, and they kind of constituted an elite which ran the country's armies more or less. Traditionally, even within the medieval era, most of the army, or at least most of the trained soldiers, were landed members of the nobility, and their lands were justified by an expectation of public and, more importantly, military service. They were given such large estates because things like war horses and armor and the ability to spend a lot of your time training, was something that took up a lot of resources, particularly during a very poor era where families could barely afford food. Like nowadays, food probably only takes up maybe 10% of our income if you make a decent wage. And back in the day, it was like 70% or something. I mean, obviously, that's not the exact numbers, but you get my point. So back in the day, the nobility kind of justified their existence through that and through other government and political service forms. There's a lot of reasons for that, just kind of the nature of society, and we'll get into that as we kind of talk about why the old order, in my view, failed and collapsed almost universally over a period of about 100 years from the Napoleonic Wars over, and why the new order emerged and kind of what I think between them. So monarchy is an often a very beloved concept within the alt-right, and within kind of traditionalist circles. It's kind of seen as the first form of government, the most traditional form of government. A lot of people kind of just take it as a given, more or less, that monarchy is the ideal form of government, that we would be better if we were off under a monarchy. And I've kind of come to be more or less indifferent to monarchy over time. I used to be a monarchist largely because the first person really within this community I ever read a lot of was Mad Monarchist, and a lot of his ideas sunk in. But then I kind of came to realize something. The traditional monarchies and the traditional aristocratic societies utterly failed and collapsed in the face of modernity. Many of them collapsed almost immediately. The Bourbons fell almost as soon as modernity started. The Austro-Hungarian Empire completely imploded. So did the Ottoman Empire. The German Empire eventually faced the same fate, although it held out a lot longer. The monarchs in Britain lost all their power. All the Scandinavian monarchs lost all their power. Monarchy, more or less, was either reduced to kind of its pathetic figurehead status of today, or was abolished outright, often with very little pushback. Generally speaking, it's hard to think of a country that had a monarchy where the monarch actually attempted to fight to retain power. In most cases, they more or less gave up and left. So I guess I'm trying to talk about why did this happen? Why do I think monarchy isn't really kind of the answer? Why can't we just go back to it? I think the problem with the old order was it was a failure to understand that society had changed. And before people tell me I'm just saying current year, to some extent, it was kind of an issue of current year. There's kind of an unwillingness to accept that society had changed over the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly since the French Revolution. The social order was completely different than what it had been in the past. So I'm just going to go over a couple reasons why I think this is the case. Firstly and foremostly, we had such an increase in resource production as a result of the Industrial Revolution that most people were increasingly becoming literate. You also had newspapers and other public news sources. Information was much harder to repress and control. In the past, you maybe had a couple little pamphlets or newspapers, but as can particularly be seen during the French and American Revolution, the invention of the printing press and kind of the development of mass production of various things like newspapers, handbills, pamphlets, combined with an increasingly literate public, meant that information and ideas could be disseminated a lot better. As society became more wealthy, people started to have more free time, in addition to more education, to kind of consider intellectual pursuits. Political ideology wasn't really important prior to the French Revolution. I mean, it existed. You had kind of the Whigs and the Tories. But really, when you had the French and American revolutions happening, it's kind of one of the first times in kind of modern history, or kind of the beginning of modernity, where we really start to see political ideology take a center stage. And I kind of personally, in my view, attribute that to the emergence of a middle class, which hadn't been very large before. The emergence of a larger middle class, increased literacy, and increased desire to kind of focus on higher order things. I know people probably say that it's wrong to mention Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but I think there's some truth to it. With the Industrial Revolution, food was a lot cheaper, basic goods were a lot cheaper, and when people were no longer really in as much danger of starving, the new emerging middle class could more fully turn themselves to politics. And this was starting to go in that direction even in the 18th century, but really picked up during the 19th century. So we had that. We also had advancements in technology in terms of making the world smaller. Prior to this era, a lot of people would just never leave the house or the town in which they're built in. They had to travel between cities on horseback or walk, and this was a very slow process. So travel was often for specific professions that required it, or for kind of the rich. But during this period, we had steamships, we had trains, we had telegraph lines. It became possible for middle class and even lower class people to travel throughout the country. It was possible for them to go overseas. And this kind of also made colonial empires possible. And I kind of viewed the foundation of nationalism as to be kind of a combination of these various factors. Kind of an increase in higher order thinking of more kind of abstract concepts around the middle class. Also increased communication and increased literacy and education. My kind of thought of how it happened was the variant of changed their perspective on who the other is, because they were starting to get more and more exposure to Germany. And to some extent, this is where kind of we start seeing a pan-European identity and eventually a white identity. Developing out of increased exposure to foreign cultures, increased exposure to people who were completely different, who relatively made the local people seem less different from one another. I would also imagine, just from my understanding, that the increase in kind of media production and the increase in mass communication started to standardize language a lot more. Standardization of spelling, standardization of pronunciation, and a lot of kind of the local dialects kind of started to die out, particularly with the introduction of state education. So we kind of have all these things that are creating a more ideologically motivated, more educated middle class that has begun to kind of take a bigger interest in politics. And I kind of think the failure of the old order was not recognizing that things had changed, not recognizing that people, they weren't just facing peasant revolts anymore. They were facing kind of a modern middle class who had become, in many cases, more wealthy than the old aristocracy. They also, I don't think, realized just how much military technology had changed. Now, if you go back and you read some of the accounts from the Crusades, you will see heavily armored European knights killing like literally dozens or hundreds of Muslims who didn't have heavy armor and often wore no armor at all. I think in one battle it was like 10,000 versus like 50, and the Christian forces won. This is during an era where wealth mattered a lot more in terms of what you could do on the battlefield, because a suit of armor made you virtually unbeatable in a lot of contexts, particularly if you had a significant number of knights. They were just battle tanks. Peasant armies didn't stand a chance. A knight could literally take on dozens of peasants, or at least a group of knights could take on dozens of peasants and just kind of chop them down, and the peasants couldn't really do much other than throw sticks at him and maybe try and use some agricultural implements. But we start to get firearms. Now, these firearms are a lot cheaper than armor is. You don't have to buy a full suit of armor. You don't need to train someone for years to use a sword properly. Like learn a kind of like in Japan, everyone learned sword styles. They studied since birth. Now you had people who could just be given a musket, maybe given a couple weeks of training on how to fire and reload, and you could levy them into the army, and they could kill one of these old aristocrats with one shot. And the amount of resources taken to train him and give him a musket was incomparably less. So kind of aristocratic nobility in terms of the military function kind of lost a purpose. I mean, they persisted for a while in terms of the officer corps and the cavalry, but in a lot of cases the kind of military aristocratic elite really disgraced themselves, particularly during the First World War, where the officer corps was largely composed of the old gentry, and in many cases they just couldn't get with the times, as it were. They were still using strategies that were completely outmoded and led to the deaths of millions of people, and really didn't accomplish much on a lot of the fronts. So that last kind of bit of faith in them as kind of an aristocratic military class, in my view, collapsed during World War One and in other parts of this time period. Also, just the aristocracy kind of started to decline in wealth, as I said, relative to the middle class. So we have a society with a much more educated population. We have a society that's beginning to develop a national identity. We have a society in which the common man is more dangerous than like a well-trained aristocratic noble warrior. This period also sees the beginning of kind of total war or mass armies. This is done partially because of advancements in agriculture and production that allowed outfitting large armies to be very more possible than in previous eras, particularly with regards to railways. It also comes from nationalism, because of nationalism, they could raise patriot armies. People were motivated to join the army out of patriotism. You could recruit large numbers of the lower classes of society and have them serve pretty reliably in the army, which is kind of what Napoleon discovered. He was kind of, in my view, the first one to really take advantage of the concept of using nationalism to raise a huge force, giving them all muskets, and just kind of cutting down the old aristocracy. So I think that's another change. I think they were just unwilling or unable to accept that the political arena had expanded a lot. There's a much larger percentage of the people who wanted to be more involved in society. There's a much larger educated class who thought that they deserved some share of the power. And this is partially just due to kind of arrogance on the nobility's part and an unwillingness to get with the times. People say, well, that's progressive of you, RG. Well, maybe it is to a certain extent, but the reality is all these regimes collapsed, many of whom under very similar circumstances. Either kind of a group of liberal middle class men eventually took control of government due to the decrepit, declining importance of the aristocracy and their lack of wealth, or there were mass revolutions largely perpetrated by an upstart middle class. If we look at the 19th century, there tends to be a very much a opposition of the monarchs of the period to ideas of nationalism, to ideas of political ideology. In my view, that the countries that survived the longest as absolute or powered monarchies, Germany and Russia, I think, were the most successful cases, and to some extent Spain under Franco, which was technically a monarchy. came about because the monarchs were more willing to adapt. Eventually, Bismarck and the Prussian monarchs embraced nationalism, embraced pan-Germanism, and provided the reforms that the middle class had been asking for. And they were largely satiated by this and willing to accept the continued existence of an aristocracy. What ultimately brought about the end of the German Empire was not really a failure of the old order as losing an extremely costly war. It would be interesting to see what would have happened had Germany not lost World War One. How their political system would have developed. It might have become an illiberal democracy, but I can't see it developing in the same way that England did without a massive loss of self-confidence that was experienced during the First World War and in another of other incidents. Probably the most tone-deaf of the monarchies was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was more or less a multicultural, multi-ethnic empire that was based on the idea of being a personal union of these various largely unrelated peoples who are often deeply divided by religion, culture, and ethnicity, just kind of fused together under a monarch, which is a very old kind of idea, because nationalism didn't really exist in its modern form back in the day. So the Habsburgs were just through their kind of legal right, were capable of controlling large disparate parts of Europe. Like, they controlled Austria, they controlled Holland and Belgium, they controlled Spain, they controlled southern Italy, just kind of all these provinces that aren't geographically connected and aren't really related to each other. So they were able to do that, but times had changed. It's no longer enough to just assert that the king owns it and there should be a union, and that you should be loyal to a distant monarch who's not your ethnic group and isn't your culture and may not even be your religion, and to just be loyal to them and ignore kind of your own national identity. And that was kind of the expectation the Austro-Hungarian Empire put on its people. And in the end, they had to resort to using most of their money to paying off the various minorities and practicing extensive affirmative action, which kind of left them incapable of fighting a modern war. And they just had a very old-fashioned military command structure and very old-fashioned battle tactics. And it just served them extremely poorly in the First World War. I think it would have collapsed regardless of the First World War. I think the whole system was just completely improbable at that point in time, which is kind of why you started to see a movement during this period of pan-Germanists who wanted Austria to be annexed by Germany, because they kind of realized the game was over, and they thought, well, we can be a important cultural center and economic center within a bigger homogenous empire than ruling over this scattered collection of states where we're a very small minority and having our country basically drained dry to maintain an empire that doesn't benefit us in any real sense personally. So, basically, I kind of see democracy and liberalism to a certain extent as a product of the unwilling, not only just the new middle class, but as a product of the old aristocracy being incapable of offering kind of new solutions, kind of accepting these dramatic social and economic changes and really presenting kind of a more modernized form. And I'm not saying to just adopt progressivism or abandon traditionalism or anything like that, but the reality was, unless they did something to kind of appeal to the changes in society, or at least use enough repression to stop it, I think the result was more or less inevitable. So let's enter fascism now, shall we? So fascism, I don't see why people say it's a left-wing ideology. I guess because it's revolutionary in nature, but I definitely do view it as a right-wing ideology. It's just kind of different than the old aristocracy, different than the old order, because the old order no longer existed by the time of the post-World War II, World War I era. Most of the old order countries, the most conservative old order countries, those being Russia, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and a couple others, had more or less collapsed in the wake of World War One. There was really no more kind of traditionalist societies, or not really any major ones that were governed as kind of an aristocracy. Mass politics and mass democracy had become the norm in all of them. Even within countries that were still nominal monarchies, the monarch really didn't play any further role in politics, and the aristocracy saw whatever little powers they had left fade away. So, to my view, the reactionaries during this period, while well-intentioned, were kind of trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship. They were trying to put back society to before the French Revolution and not really understanding or noticing how much things had changed. The issue is, had they been able to seize power and repress and maybe reprogram the public, they might have been able to change things, but even that kind of went against their ideology. The idea of using propaganda, the idea of any sort of mass political movement was anathema to them. They just said that it was bad. We can't let the plebs be involved in government. We can't do that. And so they largely kind of faded into irrelevancy. So during this period, though, there is a strong reaction to communism, to increasing secularization, to liberalism, etc. But there's this power void. There's not a right anymore. The old right had basically collapsed and disappeared, and society was largely composed of left-wing parties and maybe a couple liberal parties that are considered right-wing for reasons I can only guess at. So society now had these, but there was no opposition. The Socialist Party had basically managed to to recruit the majority of kind of the common man, as it were, and the middle class was still largely liberal. The only people who were kind of interested in aristocracy were maybe the military and the upper class, but in a democratic age, that's not enough. And then we see kind of like the German National People's Party, or whatever it's called, failing to win election after election after election to the various left-wing parties. Italy is very much the same during this period, as is France and eventually Britain. The right in the countries just kind of became completely ineffective. So we get Mussolini and kind of the fascist movement, which I view as a reaction to that. I view it as kind of an updated form of rightism that kind of accepted that things had changed. It said, okay, we need to embrace modern media, modern technology. We need to appeal to kind of the modern base. We have to acknowledge that the average man is interested in political ideology, is interested in the kind of collective identity of a nation, that he wants to serve his nation, he wants something out of his nation, that he's not kind of bound to a monarch anymore, but he wants to serve Italy, or he wants to serve Germany, or he wants to serve France. He doesn't want to serve a king, and if he does serve a king, he wants to serve a king who is the embodiment of the nation. He wants to serve a German monarch, an Italian monarch who's quintessentially German or Italian, instead of like in the Habsburg Empire, an emperor who was kind of distant and wasn't really relevant ethnically or culturally to the common population. So Mussolini kind of got the idea, well, we're going to create a rightist movement that embraces a lot of the changes in society and yet is kind of reactionary. So people will say, well, because of the fascist social programs, their use of mass politics, their mass mobilization, their government control of the economy, they were a left-wing movement. Well, I guess in a certain sense, if we're just saying that right-wing and left-wing is down to economic factors and more government means left and less government means right. But you have to understand these regimes in many cases, the fascist regimes, dramatically rolled back feminism. I think women couldn't vote under a lot of them. The ideal that was held up was that women should stay home and raise the children. The various fascist regimes were very much against the idea of women working. They kind of championed The idea they in many cases idealized women, but they idealized them in a very traditional sense. They very much kind of idealized a patriarchal, masculine culture. Um, in a lot of senses, they kind of did reverse a lot of the changes in gender equality that happened over time. They rejected egalitarianism. They thought that all the different classes of society should, in common, kind of serve the nation. That they should like carpenters and laborers and miners and bankers and clerks, all these people from different classes were not equal. They were different. Everyone was different. They had a different set of skills, but that all the skills should be put to use to serve the nation. So it was a rejection of egalitarianism. It was a rejection of equality, but it was at the same time recognizing that in a modern world, people were more defined by nation than they were really by locality or by social class, as they had been in the past. Because in the past you had kind of this more idea of universal nobility, but now national identity was a lot more important than just someone being a noble or a commoner. So they embraced that. They embraced the idea that you needed propaganda. Now, propaganda is used in a number of contexts, normally a negative connotation. In Mein Kampf, when Hitler talks about propaganda, he doesn't really mean necessarily that it's a lie or that it's fake. He means political education. That people should be taught about German history, that people should be taught about what fascist ideology is. Not necessarily that it should be a lie, but that the political education of an educated middle class has to be a core component of any modern kind of right-wing movement. That it's not enough to just kind of rely on the passivity of the populace. There's also kind of an acknowledgement that you do need some government control of the economy, particularly in light of increasing globalization and international trade. You need government restrictions on culture for a similar reason, because people were exposed to more cultures and to international competition like never before, just because of how cheap transport costs were increasingly getting. So I more or less do view fascism as a rightist ideology. In many cases, it was deeply concerned with preserving the traditions, and in many cases, the religion of the country with which it was based. The different forms of fascism were very much geared towards the uniqueness of the country. For instance, the Latin variations of fascism were much less race conscious and were much more kind of about traditional Latin manly virtues. Also about Catholicism and kind of the spiritual purpose of the nation, whereas German fascism was much more about kind of materialistic reductionism in kind of the context of the race and the superiority of Germany. British fascism rejected totalitarianism to a large extent and championed free speech, private property rights, and privacy. Whereas Romanian fascism was much more religious in nature and actually put the spiritual resurrection of the nation ahead. So it was very much dependent. It was not kind of this universal one-size-fits-all ideology. It was an attempt to kind of take a lot of the values of the old order and kind of the identity of the country and apply it in a modern sense. That's why it's often called reactionary modernism. It was kind of an attempt to take the ideas of the past and apply them in a modern way, and to try to appeal to modern ideas like the improvement of working conditions, workers' rights, national grandeur, mass entertainment, mass culture, the need for more education, for all these various things. So I kind of see it as kind of a necessary change and one that was probably ultimately beneficial. The issue is more or less after World War II, which destroyed most of these regimes and most of these movements, and the Holocaust also kind of delegitimized them in the eyes of most of people. So that kind of led the right to abandon mass politics again and to kind of try to retreat from society, because it kind of felt that it couldn't really be involved in it anymore. And so we kind of got the scenario where the right went through the last half of the 20th century, where they withdrew from the public sector entirely. They stopped trying to influence the public. They abandoned kind of the idea that you should have mass movements, that you need to try to appeal to the average man, that the idea that political education isn't a good thing, that plebs are going to pleb, etc. And if we're just left alone and kind of try to, I guess, I kind of view the the right of the later half to kind of have more in common in some ways than the with the old order, because it kind of championed this very much a kind of rigid traditionalism. It kind of ignored the realities of a changing world. I say rigid traditionalism in kind of a more modern context, because like in America, it's just ma constitution, and that's really all the right stands for, is that, which is kind of traditional to America. But there's an unwillingness to accept a lot of the population doesn't care about that. There's an unwillingness to accept that times have changed, and that while the Constitution is probably still good and we should probably still keep it, at the same time their opponents don't care about it anymore. And they need to do more than just point to the Constitution and say, it says there, this and this. So that's kind of my thoughts on the matter. I hope that makes some sense. It'll probably irritate some people, but that's kind of my view as to what happened, my thoughts on the matter, and kind of some of the issues I've developed with monarchy and kind of some of these very I don't really want to use any pejoratives, but just kind of some forms of traditionalism, I guess is a fair way to put it. So this is Argent Templar. Hope you enjoyed the video. Signing out.